Some see a city. We see a 300 square mile residence, currently shared by over 8.5 million people who have made it their own. From kings and trailblazers to explorers and visionaries. Generations of the most influential families and some of the most colorful characters. Engaging eyewitnesses, eye-opening discoveries, and even some animals. After centuries of remodeling, we can't imagine living anywhere else. It's more than a city. To us, it's home. Welcome home. We're glad you're here.
We thought it was a good time to talk with some of the artists who we have worked with.
It wasn't so much the mask that really got to me, it was the eyes, because you see that primal fear in people.
We kind of question the fundamental information that are asked on the census.
It was almost like a ritual that you get up in the morning and you get to the park by 10 o'clock, 9:30, and you don't leave until sunset, sundown.
Hi, I'm Whitney Dondhauser, the Ronay Menschel Director of the Museum of the City of New York, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the latest Curators from the Couch, our video series featuring important and relevant voices and topics streamed live, often from our curator's own living room to yours. Today's episode of Curators from the Couch is tied to our ongoing exhibition, Activist New York, an amazing show that examines New York's long history with activism. Leading the charge for this conversation about voting rights is our very own Puffin Foundation curator for social activism, Sarah Seidman. I invite you to come experience Activist New York and the other exhibitions here on view. Our doors are open, safety protocols are in place, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Be sure to check our website for time tickets and all the information you need to visit safely. We are open to visitors, and we will be continuing conversations like these and other virtual programming to address the important issues that are woven into New York's past and present and that shape our future. As we continue to stay connected during this socially distanced time, we are so grateful for your support and hope you will consider making a donation to the museum so that we can continue to present a range of virtual and in-person programming. No amount is too small, and any help is greatly appreciated to ensure that the museum can share these stories for generations to come. Thanks again for being with us. Now I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Whitney, and hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism at the Museum of the City of New York, and welcome to the latest installation of Curators from the Couch. I'm here on my couch in my, marginally well-lighted room, and you're in for a truly important discussion today. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about voting rights activism, past and present, all with an eye on the upcoming election. It is right around the corner. And today I'm speaking with two amazing guests, so really welcoming them both back to the museum. Activist and organizer Brea Baker and Dr. Peniel Joseph, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at University of Texas at Austin. So welcome back. I'm gonna give your longer and accomplished bios in a second, but first a little background on Activist New York, an ongoing exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York on view in the Puffin Foundation Gallery. It examines how New Yorkers have advocated, agitated, and exercised their power to shape the city and the nation's future. And covers or glimpses at centuries of activist efforts across a spectrum of political ideologies that are illuminated through a series of 14 sections that show the 17th century through today. So there's a lot in there, and it has artifacts and images from our collection, as well as pieces on loan from other collections, organizations, and individuals, interactive elements that enable visitors to explore and express their views, and includes a section on the civil rights movement in New York in the 1940s through 60s. And within that, activists like Brea Baker and Stokely Carmichael, who were in New York and left the city to work on voter registration and mobilize against the disenfranchisement and violence that met Black Americans. And we also recently added to our section on the movement for Black Lives, which is shown in the images now, including how Black activists are now emphasizing voting as a tool in the activist toolbox. So clearly there's a lot to talk about here, and let's get to it. First, let's meet powerhouse activist and organizer Bria Baker. She received a BA in political science from Yale University, which she puts to use contributing to dozens of electoral and advocacy campaigns, including the 2017 Women's March, where she served as the youngest national organizer, the campaign to free Meek Mill, the 2018 student walkouts against gun violence, Jumaane Williams' successful bid for public advocate in New York, just to name a few. And Bria has been recognized as a 2017 Glamour Woman of the Year, 2019 ID Up and Rising, and speaks about her work globally. We're thrilled to have her back here with the museum today, so welcome back. And it's equally thrilling to speak with Dr. Peniel Joseph, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at UT Austin. Before joining UT, Dr. Joseph was a professor at Tufts University, where he also founded the school's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He received a BA from SUNY at Stony Brook, a PhD from Temple University, and fellowships from Harvard University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Ford Foundation, and is a frequent media commentator and commentator on issues of race, democracy, civil rights, has authored award-winning books, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. And his most recent book, which I finally got the galley from the museum where it had been sent, I think in early 2020. So now I can't wait to read it, The Sword and the Shield, or read all of it. The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Examines the political lives of two social movement leaders who assumed divergent but crucially similar roles. Welcome back as well. I think I just want to say you were the first public program I did at the museum when I started. So it's so exciting to have you back and to have you both here. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me /us. And it's such an honor to sit on this couch conversation with you, Dr. Joseph. So this is going to be good stuff.
Oh no, great. Thank you. Thank you, Bria. Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here. So I'm excited. And it's still time to early vote. I early voted in Texas on Tuesday, last Tuesday, and this is our second week of early voting until Friday, and then the election.
I'm so glad we have, the New York experts who are fanning across the country and can speak to, different scenarios on the ground in different states. So, I'm excited to talk about it more. So Dr. Joseph, you describe your career focus as Black Power Studies. Can you talk a bit, just for framing, about what that means to you and how that has evolved in this moment, and where electoral politics and voting rights activism fall within this historical framework?
Yeah, I actually I'm doing a piece for CNN. I write regularly for them about Ice Cube and the vote and 50 Cent. And so what I'll say when I think of the Black Power movement, and I've been in the space of Black feminism for 27, 28 years, through Sonia Sanchez, but for longer than that, because my mother, I was raised by my single Haitian mother, Haitian immigrant, born in Manhattan, raised in Brooklyn and Queens, and who came to the United States in 1965. My mom's a feminist. She's 81. She's a trade unionist. So I was on my first picket line at 6, 7 years old in New York City, East 92nd Street, Mount Sinai Hospital. So when I come to the academy by way of activism and was part of all these movements against police brutality in the 1980s and the 1990s. So even pre-Yusef Hawkins, so we're thinking about Eleanor Bumpurs, Michael Griffith, Howard Beach, just so many different things that happened even before Sean Bell and Amadou Diallo. I was over 21 by the time those things happened. So I grew up in a very racially segregated New York City. But what I mean by Black Power studies, and I think Black Lives Matter is connected to this, and so is Black feminism, is these radical movements for social, political, economic, cultural self-determination that have tried to reimagine American democracy while simultaneously trying to reimagine identity, citizens and subjects. And so from that perspective, when we think about the vote has been crucial. And so we think about not just people like Frederick Douglass, but people like Ida Wells and Nannie Helen Burroughs, and so many of these Black women who, Frances Harper, Martha Jones's new book, Vanguard, really details and distills that struggle. But as somebody who's been in this space, there's other books like Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire, which is this brilliant Black feminist anthology. Of course, the works of Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and the Conby River Collective. But in terms of contemporary spaces, Keonga Yamada Taylor and Brittany Cooper and Keisha Blaine and Tressie McMillan Cottom. So when we think about this Black power studies, it's always talking about intersectional issues, but also intersectional identity, because there were Black Power era feminists like the Third World Women's Alliance, right? And I think where we're at today, because Black Lives Matter has been so influential, building off of the work of people like Martin and Malcolm, but also women like Amy Jacques Garvey and Amy Ashwood and Lorraine Hansberry and so many others, that we're at a very interesting point, because Black women are the leading, most reliable Democratic voters. They're the biggest activists and organizers, both for the Democratic Party, but also for BLM. And this idea of sort of using voting rights as a vehicle for radical and revolutionary social transformation, in terms of Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley, who I know, and others, is really, really remarkable. So I think we're at a real hinge point. But getting back to Ice Cube and 50 Cent, though, too, that there's part of what's so interesting about this period is that we usually think of Black freedom struggles as having been sort of cisgender, straight Black men sort of leading the charge. So Jesse Jackson, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. But even during that history, you're going to have James Baldwin and Bayard Rustin. You're going to have Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, right? And I think this year and this period of BLM, when you think about Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, but people like Tamika Mallory and No Name and others, has really been a year where the organizing connects with the face and the symbol of the movement. So the symbol and the substance connect. And I think what's extraordinary is BLM is really, they've expansively reimagined American democracy and freedom struggles. And it's not that they're saying there's no place for cisgender straight Black men. It's just that you don't necessarily have to be central to lead, right? So it's the argument that the most marginal people within the group, who often are Black women and trans women and queer folks and people who are mentally, emotionally challenged, who are non-able-bodied, who are homeless, who are cash poor, who are HIV positive, those are the people who we should be exalting. Along the way, we redefine institutions and democracy where we're going to get our own freedom dreams achieved as well. So when you see Ice Cube rush to the line to do his own contract with Black America, it's not the idea that's wrong, and he's got every right to do that, but the problematic is that this is a moment where all these Black women have been leading, and there's been really national and international recognition of that leadership. And it is connected to the vote and voting, but Black women and Black men for that matter too, have historically looked at the vote as just the tip of the spear, right? So the vote is there to leverage these things about childcare and elder care and desegregation and housing affordability and wealth creation and to stop domestic violence and abuse, and environmental racism, and clean air and clean water, and to end food deserts. So there's so much stuff going on at this point. But I would say that when I think about Black Lives Matter, and I think about saying Black Power studies, it's all connected and links us to this moment, but it also requires a shift for all of us to just decenter ourselves from the narrative. But in doing so, that's your leadership, right? So somebody like Cube, 50 Cent seems to be a lost cause, saying he doesn't want to pay taxes, so he's supporting Trump. But certainly Cube, I know Cube has his heart in the right place. And as a Gen Xer, I go back to 1990 with Ice Cube, America's Most Wanted and then Death Certificate. So these are rebellious and wanting a revolution, but the revolution can't just be led by straight Black men who somehow, freedom means this idea of the assertion of a Black male patriarchy instead of freedom from the bounds of that. So we need a post-patriarchal kind of Black masculinity. Brittany Cooper and other people have talked about it, but I think we can see right now we desperately need that. And this is linked to voting. It's linked to ending mass incarceration, because unless we free our community of that, we're always going to get these Black men who are straight, or they may not be even, but who think that freedom and liberation is connected to their own dominance over the movement. And it's still just a plurality. It's just a plurality, but it's still problematic and troubling.
I just love that. Like, thank you for saying it in that way. That was such a mic drop moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That was like an incredible crash course and an encapsulation of so many different factors. And I appreciate, the feminist and intersectional lens through which, we need to be considering everything that's happening right now. And Bria, would love for you to talk about that as well. In addition to just thinking about, what we were talking about over email recently about, the legacy of New Yorkers who've traveled south. And Peniel, I know you've written about this too with Carmichael and others. Carmichael going south, Ella Baker going back south, right, who were instrumental to Freedom Summer, doing voter registration work in Mississippi in 1964. And Bria, I know you've been integrally involved in getting out the vote and educating people during this time. So I guess, what are some takeaways with what you've been seeing and experiencing, and how do you feel the legacy of those earlier mobilizations, be it Freedom Summer, but also, what Dr. Joseph is talking about this radical Black and feminist tradition?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. I mean, it's completely connected, because those who are going back south, there's this homeland piece connected to returning to the South that we have to talk about. And so what we were mentioning before is that with the Great Migration, you had a lot of Black people fleeing the violence of the South and saying that the South was not a space where they could thrive, where they could raise families, where they could grow and get that mobility. And then really realizing if we didn't all leave, then what vacuum did we leave behind for those who stayed? And how do we fill that void and recognize that whether we chose to stay or not, we do still have this ancestral responsibility to not ceding the South. And I hear this happening all the time because, especially those coming from blue states who are very out of touch with the reality that's happening in the South. You have a lot of people who are sort of just give part of the country to the racists and let them do what they want to do there. And let's do what we want to do here. And it's but that might work for you, but for Black people who are refusing to give up their claim to the land that they cultivated, that they built, to the indigenous people whose land that still is, what does that mean to just give it over to the racists and think that will mean we will have our own separate haven from them? So I think, again, it's a part of that. My liberation is bound in yours. And I can't consider myself free up in Chicago or New York or Philadelphia or in California when people in the South are still experiencing what they're experiencing. And so that's what I saw with what SNCC was doing with their voter registration efforts. It also is sort of part of Martin Luther King's lineage of recognizing, like from the letter from a Birmingham jail, like an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And we can't just like relinquish the South as if that is a bartering chip that we can afford to give up. So I think it definitely stems from that. And so I consider myself now part of that great return of young Black people who are returning to the South and saying like, no, I want to fight for this land. And I recognize that that we don't, what responsibility do we have to holding on to that? And so, you know, I don't have plans to leave the South anymore. I feel really connected to it. My family, I can trace where my family's from in North Carolina. And I was just sitting with my grandmother a few weeks ago, just sort of like, oh, when are you voting? And hearing her stories with voter suppression. She's an older woman who's incredibly immunocompromised. And absolutely should be part of the target demographic of mail-in voting. And she had the hardest time getting that, to the point where she had to vote early and in person. That shouldn't have been something that she had to do, but she knows that there's something that she's shouldering there. And if we're leaving behind only our grandparents and great-grandparents to shoulder that, we're doing such a disservice to what they went through and survived on our behalf. So for Black people returning to the South, there's definitely this like, this pull that's like, no, come back, don't give up on this. And we see that in the organizing that's happening here, in song, in Southerners, you know, Southerners on New Ground, in Sister Song, which is doing reproductive justice work for women of color and specifically Black women in the South. And so organizations and groups like that, SNAP, Solutions Not Prison, Not Punishment, in Atlanta, there's so many groups that are doing that work in a meaningful way, and they're looking for the rest of the country to not give up on the South and not say, all right, let's just give it over to them and like sort of like undo what we fought, or what some of us fought for in the Civil War, and say, no, we have to dig our heels in this, because if we give up on the South here, it will just continue to push back, and we will see the Tea Party continuing to encroach upon what they consider their America.
Absolutely. And I feel like this whole, we're in it together. Yeah, the complexities of that you're so, you know, aptly characterizing, whether everyone wants to be or not. And in this moment, of the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, we're facing that reality even more. This is really, you know, for either of you, and there's like 12 questions embedded in this question, but just a warning. But you know, in this really unprecedented, or, you know, really significant historical moment of the pandemic and Black-led uprisings against racism and violence and so much more, right, the election, everything. We've reached the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which Dr. Joseph, you mentioned, you know, earlier, in terms of also suffrage, and, you know, which we know was not fully achieved in terms of women's suffrage. And, you know, we've grappled with the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which has got me thinking a lot about Shelby v. Holder, and even thinking about our Beyond Suffrage show with Bria. We, you know, took you through a few years ago, and thinking about, well, like even just the differences now in terms of the dismantling of Voting Rights Act from when we planned that show beginning, let's say, 5 years ago. And just, you know, thinking about voting rights broadly conceived. And I know New York has its own history of voting barriers, you know, the need for language translation, and all kinds of other things, early access and early voting and absentee ballot. So I guess, right, where are we now with voting rights and access, and where do we need to go to provide more voting rights for New Yorkers and everyone, right, be it in the South, in New York, in Texas, in Georgia? So just a small question.
Just a small one.
I'll say very, very quickly, you know, we need a 50-state voting rights solution. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 was inherently flawed because it only included about 9 states. And then by 75, the second reauthorization with Barbara Jordan in the Congress Texas comes underneath the Voting Rights Act. So this is just an example. So in 65, Texas should have been under the Voting Rights Act, but it takes until 75. So you need a 50-state Voting Rights Act. It'll be very difficult to get a constitutional amendment. You need a different Supreme Court because you have a court now that whatever Congress passes is willing to legislate against the Congress, an extremely right-wing ideological court. And you also need, like what's happened in this year of racial reckoning, to make white people support voting rights for all people. Because in a lot of ways, the Voting Rights Act, sometimes we frame it as it being for Black people, but it was for all people, but it expanded American democracy to give some people access who never had access before. So when it comes to voting, that's what we need to do. And then the last thing, Sarah, is that we need to stop penalizing the vote. So all those Black people who are in jail for 5-year felony convictions, that should be stripped from the law. You see, the United States is a modern democracy that has very, very little voter fraud. We need enough political power to stop the lies, because one of the things we've seen over the last 4 years, but it's really even longer than that, is how fascism and authoritarianism has come is through a series of big lies about our reality. You know, so you're going to say Reagan's welfare queen in 1976 is part of the big lie against Black women. The Moynihan Report in 65 is part of the big lie. Voting fraud is part of the big lie. The president's 1776 commission to push back on Nicole Hannah-Jones, Black woman, won Pulitzer Prize, one of the few who's ever, right, for journalism, for the 1619 Project, right? So we need to move and say we all can vote, but we need white support for that too, where we can register. 17-year-olds should be pre-registered to vote automatically when they turn 18. Oregon does this. All 50 states should do it, right? So, you know, those are the things we need, but we're going to need white involvement at the same level that we saw. And all those corporations that were saying Black Lives Matter, whether it was sincerely or because they didn't want to be burned to the ground, they need to be part of this and give money. We need to all support the Legal Defense Fund. You know, shout out to Sherilyn Ifill and the LDF, which is doing the Lord's work in terms of to promote justice. So those are just some of the things we need to do. But, you know, there's reports that, you know, there was a Miami cop with a Trump mask at a polling location. So the law enforcement's connected to this because we have 18,000 police departments in the United States, 800,000 law enforcement, and they are what Huey Newton and the Black Panthers call, Kathleen Cleaver too, an occupying army. That's what they are. Mm-hmm. They're an occupying army that white people have licensed to kill Black people. And it doesn't matter if you have Black and Latinx law enforcement. It doesn't matter if you have queer law enforcement. The structure is corrupt and it's anti-democratic. And what we're seeing law enforcement is there to do is to preserve a status quo of white supremacy and to deny voting rights access to marginalized groups. And we're seeing all of this in real time in 2020. So those are the things post-election, whoever wins, people have to organize on day one, post this election to do.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm just like co-signing all of that. And to add another element, I think the next wave of voter disenfranchisement and suppression that we're experiencing is the disinformation campaign that's happening on social media. You have a lot of people who do have the right to vote, but are being sort of tricked out of actually using it and leveraging it for fear that it doesn't have an impact. And I think that that comes from two things, and it's not just the right. So on the right, I think that they are strategically muddling the field so much so that people don't know what to believe and whether this is a process that includes them. And so they're pulling on a real pain point where Black people, Indigenous people, people of color in general, have been made to feel like they don't have a political voice. And the right really leans in on that, like, you're right, you don't, it's a waste of your time, don't do it. And they make it just hard enough to vote in certain strategic areas where if you did decide like, fine, I'll go vote, and you got onto a line that was expecting you to wait for 11 hours, you're not going to wait that full time. And that's what I think folks are not saying enough about what's coming out of Georgia, is that for all of the people who did stay, there are 5 people who got off that line and said, I can't do this. I need childcare. I haven't eaten. My joints hurt. It's cold. Like there's so many elements there that if you were not like committed fully to voting, it's very easy in hour 3 to say, this is absolutely not worth it. I'm walking away. So that's the one area that we sort of see as the voter disenfranchisement and suppression. But then on the flip side, we have this almost like overemphasization that is happening in the Democratic Party of voting. And it feels like gaslighting almost to communities of color who, whenever they have a valid critique, they're being told, well, if you didn't vote, you don't have a right to complain. And we're talking to people who did vote and saw that their vote did not translate to change. Black women voted in overwhelming numbers for Hillary Clinton and still are getting the short end of the stick the entire Trump administration. So to tell a Black woman who sat online for 8+ hours and did vote and didn't see anything come of that, that if you vote, all of your problems will go away, it feels like, okay, now you're lying to me. And I don't know if I can actually believe what's coming from this source. You know, I saw that with like the California fires. People were like, see, this is why we vote. And it's like, okay, well, for the people in California who overwhelmingly vote blue every single cycle, what does that mean to them? They vote every year. They get in the progressives, quote unquote, and those progressives don't support a Green New Deal, right? So they're not actually progressives, but like those Democrats don't support the Green New Deal. Those Democrats aren't making that bold leadership. So we're not seeing that translate. And so I think what the Democratic Party has to do is to make sure that they're not driving that wedge deeper by over promising and under delivering. And I think that's also a form of voter suppression, because then you have a generation of young people who are like, I got my hopes up for this administration that you told me to vote for, and then my problems would go away. And that didn't happen. And if we were honest with people that voting is harm reduction, it's not going to save everything. It's not going to deliver us liberation, but it is going to make it easier for us to organize against that. And we'll still need to be vigilant. Then you have more tempered expectations of, okay, well, I'm not walking in there thinking that the person who wins is going to deliver me rainbows and sunshine and peace on earth. You know, I'm expecting that there will still be a fight, and my civic engagement doesn't end there. But there's this narrative that's sort of like, well, if you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. And we don't tell people that if they don't protest, they don't have a right to complain. We don't tell people if they don't donate to organizations, they don't have a right to complain. We only do that with voting. And it creates this antagonistic relationship I'm seeing on the ground between young people who are like, I don't believe the lie that you're telling me. And at least I feel like these people are being honest with me. At least if, you know, the right is horrible, but at least they wanted to hear Ice Cube, right? Like that's the narrative that we're hearing. And it blows my mind, because I'm like, how could you believe that the Trump administration wants anything good for us? But when on the one hand, they feel like the Democratic Party's stock response to everything is vote, and Trump is coming out with a platinum plan, they are made to believe that, well, at least he's hearing us. And at least there's a voice that we have, even though that is a false one. It's like it's a fake and created and fabricated scenario that says, oh yeah, I'll care about you for now when it's strategic for me, which is what we saw with Kanye, which is what we saw with Kim in prison reform. We see this happening consistently, but it stems from that real place of people just being like, I just want to be heard. And if I feel like the Democratic Party is talking at me, it's going to push me further and further, either away from engaging, or if I am engaging, it's not the way that they want me to engage. And I think that's an important thing that we've got to say.
I agree with everything you're saying, Bria. I'd say it also stems what we're seeing, where there's parts of the Black community that are open to really right-wing authoritarianism. It stems from the impact, and you see this 50 Cent, Get Rich or Die Trying, or even, I'm a Gen Xer, so I remember Wu-Tang, Staten Island, my New Yorkers, Cash Rules Everything Around Me, Cream, Get the Money, Dollar Dollar Bill Y'all from 93, right? And even Biggie Smalls, right? So on some levels, you can read that, and some scholars do that, is read it as a critique of what Cornel West calls gangster capitalism, right? But on another level, for a guy like 50, he's saying, look, I don't want to pay taxes. Like, you guys have shown me this country that it is about patriarchy, it is about white supremacy, it is about unfettered accumulation at the expense of all others, right? And so we also have to admit there's some Black people who have fed into that and bought into that, you know, and not just straight Black men alone. I've seen it across the board. There's some Black women, not the majority of them. There's some queer folks. There's some folks who've bought into that. Well, there's nothing wrong with this version of the Republican Party that is about this crass kind of accumulation and this kleptocracy at the expense of others, that's just the country, and it's the true face of the country. Well, what I do think, and I've debated Congressman Jim Clyburn about this in South Carolina a few years ago, and he was upset about lack of Black voter participation in Ferguson, Missouri. And I told him, I said, respectfully, Congressman Clyburn, when you're upset that they're not voting, voting is the tip of the spear of citizenship. And since then, they voted, and Ferguson's politics have changed, and there's Black people there. I think there's a new Black mayor. Things have changed, or the city council, some of it has changed. But at the time, young people were being told, why don't they vote? And he didn't understand that voting is this self-actualization of other aspects of your citizenship, like Bria is saying, in terms of it is the protesting, it is having a library card, it is having childcare and elder care and having good food and being able to think about your wellness and your own self-care simultaneously with collective care. So that means you got your own little garden and you build a community garden, a neighborhood garden simultaneously all the time. And there's only 24 hours in a day. And he wasn't understanding that the reason why so many young people don't vote in this country is that they are, especially Black and brown, they are shut out of prospects of full citizenship. What he thinks is that because of the 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, the formal segregation and white supremacy ended, and it became a choice. It became a choice. I could go to Yale like Bria. Look, I went to Stony Brook. I never had a chance in hell of going to Yale based on like my background. I just didn't, okay? And so and then I went to Temple. I had no chance of going to some kind of Ivy League university for my PhD, period. Like it wasn't a thought, it wasn't there, okay? Because I'm coming out of working class, Jamaica, Queens, Haitian, Black American, Caribbean, so very specific. Now, what's so interesting is that when we tell people that, like Bria was saying, that you're worthless because you don't vote, what we send the message to them is that they're already in situations where their lives are devalued, their hopes and dreams are devalued. And we're saying, unless you become a cog in my game, and I agree with Bria, exactly. We can have every single person vote, and you're not going to fundamentally just get a universal basic income and get Medicare for all, where we can translate that November's vote, and you say, you know what? Within 6 months, I had Medicare for all. Like I had a universal basic income, and I had housing affordability from that vote. Because if people see that, guess what? The next election, they're going to vote again. They're going to vote again because they're going to say, you know what? 6 months after I voted, 12 months after I voted, my life changed. And we all remember this. We might have gotten a degree, we got a job, and you're like, wow, I remember I had student loans, and now like I'm a professor, I've got tenure, I've got all this stuff. And you're seeing to yourself, things changed. Like I was promised all this stuff, and I actually no longer have loans, and I have a house now, all these things that I didn't have, right? You respond accordingly. That does not happen with the vote. That does not happen. So Maynard Jackson, David Dinkins, it doesn't necessarily change it in one fell swoop. And we're thinking about New York history.
Right.
We had the one Black mayor. I was there. I was on the Hastings for David Dinkins, and I was 17. And that was the summer Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing came out, because he was elected in 89 and took office January 1st, 1990. It's just 4 years. Giuliani's there from 94 to 02. And then Bloomberg's there for 12 years because he bought a third term by changing the city charter just for him, right? And so that's what we witnessed growing up. So the Ed Koch years were terrible. I thought David Dinkins was going to be. What Dinkins does is institute the first Safe City, Safe Streets program that Giuliani then amplifies, that turns into Sean Bell and Abner Louima. That's Dinkins, okay? So you could see yourself voting, have the new Black mayor, and instead of the new Black mayor talk about social justice 24/7 and employment and investment, he's saying it's a safe street, safe city program, and the white cops still rioted against him, and I remember that. And by 91, Yusef Hawkins was murdered, right? That's New York City, and that's the vote. So that's the game that people play on the Black community that Bria was talking about. And I completely agree with her. Like, you can't say that. You gotta say, and James Baldwin said he voted for Jimmy Carter in 1980, and he said he did it to buy time. He said he's buying time. He's trying to buy time against Reagan. He lost because Reagan got 2 terms and it became worse. And I agree, that's what voting does. It's buying you time to organize and resist in a major way.
Yes, 1,000,000%, 1,000,000%. And I will also say, like, there are some campaigns where you do have those, like, wow, I'm able to see it in this specific cycle. Like, there are some incredible Black mayors showing bold leadership across the country, like what Michael Tubbs is doing in Stockton, what Aja Brown is doing in Compton, who are trying those innovative things, and those cities are responding to it, right? Like, and so again, that's sort of proof that, like, the best way to engage voters is to engage them out of the cycle. When they hear from you months before the election, they are never trusting the authenticity. But when they're going off of, well, what did you do for me outside of a cycle when you weren't trying to get a vote, that excites me to show up. And so when they see, like, oh, okay, we put this, 26-year-old Black man as mayor of Stockton, and now he is bring along universal basic income as a way to deter crime. Like, that's meaningful for people who may not have resonated with the defund police movement because they didn't want to exist in a crime-filled area and community without support, and are realizing there's other ways of support, and that exists in that way. So again, I think that we're so used to thinking of GOTV as like canvassing and knocking doors, or like paying for the ads, and like some of the best GOTV you can do is your presence and like actually just being there. And that's what we're sort of missing on this side, and why we're having trouble like retaining that, and why we feel like we have to resort to voter shaming instead of like authentically engaging people on the merit of where they want to be at. So couldn't agree more.
So many good points. Thank you. And I appreciate, right, both of your framing of voting as one tool, like in an activist toolbox, and that, right, get out the vote doesn't end on election day, and what folks are doing all of the time, but still so much work to be done that, you both are doing in various ways, but it can feel overwhelming. And Bria, I know you've shared in the past that activism makes you feel hopeful. So given this year and this moment, wanted to, right, end with that hopeful, that question to you, like, has this year made you feel hopeful in any way, or our moment? What potential and hope does this current moment contain? And that is my timer telling me that it's our last question, and then we'll have a question or two from the audience after that.
Okay, cool. So I'll answer really quickly. Just, I say that because Angela Davis has that quote that to be an activist is to be an optimist. Like, you can't do this work not thinking that you actually have the potential to change and transform the way that we think about things. And I do feel hopeful. I mean, stacking 2020 against 2013, when the non-acquittal came in for George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin, you can see that the conversation has evolved. Whereas in that moment, we were still talking about body cams and things that were sort of reactive. And in this moment, we were really getting to the root of it, and not just in a way where it was just young people, but I know in my day-to-day life that I was having conversations with older members of my family that I never thought I would have, actually talking about, well, what is an alternative to policing, and like getting that thinking to be different. And I think that's the biggest shift that you can make, is like, yes, we want to be able to say that we passed certain legislation and we got certain people elected, but getting our people on one accord and like shifting the consciousness in a different way is so powerful, because once that's done, you can't undo it. Like, once you reimagine, like, oh wait, it doesn't have to be this way, there's another way of doing it, you can't relimit yourself. There's now a whole range of possibilities that have been opened up, and if we stay committed to it, there's nothing we can't do. So I'm not naive to believe that we are going to transform policing overnight, but even recognizing that, like, what we're talking about in the US is happening in other places. Nigeria has their own police brutality movement happening right now, #EndSARS, that is completely connected to what we're doing. And it's not that this is like, oh, BLM brought that on. You know, this is a movement that has happened in Nigeria many times, most recently in 2017. But what's different is that this time they're saying, we don't want you to replace SARS with a different task force. We want it abolished completely. We want to talk about that too. And we're seeing that global movement rise up in response to that right-wing rise that happened in 2016, and are recognizing that we can take back this power. And that makes me incredibly hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Peniel, feel free to jump in with your thoughts on this as well.
You know, I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. And I agree with Angela Davis. But I do think that what this year has shown, in addition to all the millions of people out on the streets for racial justice, is just the depth and breadth of the violence and the violent opposition. And the very fact that we've seen what was the historic Confederacy is morphed into an effort at just full-blown fascism in the United States, backed by both racial terrorists, backed by white supremacists, backed by law enforcement and the military, and backed by elected officials and aspects of corporate America. That's exceedingly frightening. That's exceedingly frightening. And that's real. That's the resistance that you're facing. So even as I'm hopeful, I understand that resistance that you're facing, we see plots against Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. And so much of that resistance is based deep-seated anti-Black racism, deep-seated misogyny and hatred of women, at times anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, transphobia, and queerphobia. So much of it is rooted in that. And remember, the Kenosha shooter was not young. So one of the biggest lies we tell ourselves in terms of American exceptionalism is somehow there's a new generation of white folks who are getting better and better. And that's just not true. I mean, there are the folks who are trying to be anti-racist and went out on the street, God bless them. But I'm saying the country is racist, the country is sexist and patriarchal, deeply homophobic, queerphobic. How can you expect not to produce people like this? So the depth and breadth of the challenges and the way in which we're seeing our institutions die right before our eyes. The Supreme Court has no more legitimacy in the United States. The federal courts, the appellate courts, with a president who's a white supremacist bragging that he put over 300 different federal judges on there who the ABA has rated unqualified to be judges, right? So how can you seek justice in an institution, in a society where the institutions are not legitimate? And those are the institutions that you're seeking redress. So this is not 1954 and the Brown decision. This is like, where are you going to see? And that's why people are trying to seek justice in the streets. But we're in trouble as a democracy. And I think we all know this. We know this. So even as I'm optimistic, we have to understand that. Like, this is a huge, huge mountain. This is the tallest mountain in the world that you're trying to climb. And you're at the bottom of the hill, base camp, saying, here's what we're going to do and store our food and try to have a strategy of how to climb this mountain. That's where we're at. So we can be optimistic about that, but don't be fooled. And again, even as much as we say defund the police, reimagine public safety, we've seen Vox and other folks do investigative journalists where there are known ties and links to white supremacists and law enforcement in the United States. That is shocking and catastrophic for a democracy and a free society.
Thank you. I mean, right, there's so much more to be said, and and more work to be done, and thank you both for the work that you're doing, in various ways. And I know just curating Activist New York, and folks come in and they ask, like, is it just the same thing over and over? And yes and no, but it always gives me comfort to see that folks are always mobilizing and working to change things, even if the change that is needed is like deeply structural, as you both have mentioned, and it's not solely buying into the system or exercising your right to vote, which of course we should all do, but changing and working on the system itself. So there's so much more to be said. And I think we're about, at end time. But I do want to, thank you both for an amazing conversation, and, thank my colleagues at MCNY for all the work that went into this program. Of course, like the conversation should be continued. And for those looking to dive deeper into the history of voting rights, and the impact on today's election, you can sign up for one of our free education sessions on women's suffrage and voting rights now, slated for October 27th, 29th, and November 3rd. Done a lot of virtual work for general audiences as well as teachers and students during the pandemic. And so that will continue. And then a few other things coming up that I just want to mention quickly. The next installation of our multi-part virtual symposium, Another City, is tomorrow at 7, and will feature Garnett Cadogan and Luke Sante with the New Yorker's Vincent Cunningham, discussing current fears of evacuation of New York City, spectacle of empty streets, parks, plazas that were captured in photography. There was a great conversation recently about protest led by Vincent Cunningham as well. And then we have another exciting virtual program on October 29th, the launch of New York Magazine's Encyclopedia of New York, How NYC Changed the World. Editor Chris Bonanos will be chatting about it, so tune back in for that. And you can always sign up or learn more about the exhibitions on view at our website, mcny.org. You can also donate to one of our exhibitions or programs. No amount is too small, and support is greatly appreciated. But also a reminder that we are open and are excited to welcome you back for those who feel comfortable coming through the doors on Fifth Ave and 104th Street. Fifth Avenue and 104th Street, and information about time, tickets, safety protocols, of which there are many, can be found on our website. And one last reminder, Election Day is on the horizon. I mean, it's already started through early voting, of course, but Election Day is in 2 weeks. Do you have a voting plan in place? Do you need assistance with that? Go to iwillvote.com to find out about deadlines, ballot drop-off locations, and more. So that is it from me. Thank you both again so much for your work and for joining me today, and see you next time. I'm just gonna keep you back.
Definitely. Thank you so much for thinking of me. And thank you, Dr. I learned so much, and I'm like, oh, I can't wait to go and Google that later.
No, we'll bring you to the center, Bria. You're terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is great. Thank you, Sarah. It's always good to hang out, even virtually.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.